The selection was never meant for someone like me. I knew it the moment I stepped into the great hall of Ashvale Keep and felt the weight of every gaze press against my skin like the flat of a cold blade. Not with cruelty. Not yet. With something quieter and somehow worse. Indifference shaped like pity, pity shaped like a smirk hidden behind embroidered sleeves and painted fans. I was the only one who did not belong here, and every torch on every stone wall seemed to flicker in agreement. My name is June. I am an Omega of the village of Dunhollow, and I had walked 14 miles through mud and forest shadow to reach this keep, because the king's summons did not ask, it commanded. Still, standing at the edge of that hall, I understood that the summons had not been meant for me either. Ashvale Keep rose from the northeastern ridge of the Velk Mountains, like something that had grown rather than been built. A fortress of gray stone and iron-banded gates, its towers sharp as teeth against a sky the color of old pewter. Inside, the great hall breathed warmth from a hearth large enough to stable 2 horses, and the air tasted of beeswax candles, roasted boar, and something floral I couldn't name. Expensive things that lived far above my world. Tapestries depicting the Wolf King's lineage hung floor to ceiling on every wall. I did not know all the faces woven into them, but I recognized the current crest, a black wolf mid-leap over a field of silver stars. The crest of King Dominic Vielle, the Alpha King of the Velk territories. The selection happened once every 7 years. Every pack in the territories was required to send forward their eligible Omegas, those unmarked, unclaimed, and of age, for the king's court to assess. No one called it a choosing ceremony aloud, because calling it that would have made it sound like what it was, a public display of worth, ranked and reviewed like livestock at a market fair, with the added cruelty of silk gowns and candlelight. Most Omegas came hoping. Some came resigned. I had come because my pack's alpha, a broad-shouldered man named Garrett, who smelled of iron and old resentment, had shoved the royal scroll into my hands with a laugh that still rang in my ears. Might as well send you. No one here wants you anyway. He had not been wrong. I was Dunhollow's rejected Omega, the one no Beta had offered for, the one no Alpha had considered, the one who had lived in the Edge House near the woodline for 3 years since my parents passed, surviving on what the forest gave me and what charity the village occasionally remembered to leave. I was too quiet, they said. Too plain. My scent was too faint, barely there, as though even my nature had given up announcing itself. In a world that valued an Omega's presence, her warmth, her pull, her ability to calm a room and draw an Alpha's attention like flame draws a moth, a faint-scented Omega was no Omega at all. And yet, here I was. The other Omegas arrived in groups, wrapped in their pack's colors, laughing softly among themselves with the ease of women who had been told their whole lives that they were worth something. From the Harrow pack came 3, their amber and burgundy sashes bright as autumn. From the Stonecrest pack came 2, tall and silver fair. From the River clans came a 6 more, their braided hair decorated with small copper charms that caught the firelight. I wore a dress the color of storm clouds, the only good garment I owned. With a hem I had restitched twice that week because the thread kept pulling loose. My hair, dark as wet bark, was pinned simply at the back of my neck. I had no sash, no charms. No one who had whispered "you are enough" before I'd walked out the door. I found a place near the far wall, close to the serving tables, and I stood there quietly and watched. A woman named Petra, from Harrow, with a laugh like bells and a waist like a promise, glanced my way and leaned toward her companions. Whatever she said, I did not hear. But they looked at me, and then they all laughed together, light and careless, the way people laugh when the joke costs them nothing. I looked at the floor. There was a crack in the stone between my feet, long and thin, running from somewhere beneath the table to somewhere beneath the wall. I found myself following it with my eyes and thinking, without meaning to, that it looked like the kind of flaw no one would ever bother to fix. Too small to matter. Too deep to fill. I understood that feeling completely. The herald's horn sounded before I could sink further into myself. 3 long notes that silenced the hall and straightened every spine. His Majesty, Dominic Vielle, Alpha King of the Velk Territories, Sovereign of the Northern Ridge, Warden of the Ashvale Gate. The great doors at the far end of the hall opened. I had expected ceremony. I had not expected him. Dominic Vielle did not walk like a man performing his own importance. He walked like a man who had never needed to perform anything, like someone so certain of the ground beneath his feet that the ground itself rearranged to accommodate him. He was tall, broader through the shoulder than I had imagined a king to be, draped in a surcoat of deep charcoal wool edged in black wolf fur. His dark hair swept back from a face that was all hard angles, and something beneath those angles, something older than his years, and quieter than his rank. He had gray eyes, not silver, not pale, gray, like the sky before a storm decides what it wants to do. He scanned the room with those eyes, and for a single, impossible moment, they paused. Not on Petra of Harrow, with her copper-bright laugh. Not on the silver-fair women of Stonecrest. They paused on the crack in the floor. No, on me, standing beside it, my hem slightly crooked, my hands folded like I was trying to make myself smaller than I already was. His expression did not change. He looked away. The king took his seat upon the dais, and the court settled into its ritual. The introductions began. Each Omega approached. Each was assessed by the court's Gamma advisor, a wiry, hawk-eyed man named Aldrich, who seemed to exist in a permanent state of restrained contempt. Scent was measured. Standing was noted. Names were written on parchment. When they came to me, Aldrich looked at his list, looked at me, and looked at his list again. June, of Dunhollow. He said it without inflection, the way one might read a word one cannot quite place. Yes, my lord. Your Pack Alpha, Garrett of Dunhollow, submitted your name. He said this as though it were a minor administrative curiosity, not a thing worth questioning aloud. You are unspoken for. Yes, my lord. And your scent designation? Around me, I felt the subtle shift, the attention that had ignored me now sharpening, hungry for something that would confirm what they'd already decided. Omega, I said. Aldrich waited, stylus poised. Your scent strength? I held myself very still. Faint. The silence that followed was not silence. It was the held breath before a crowd decides whether to laugh or simply move on. They chose the middle road, a quiet ripple of murmurs, restrained but carrying, moving through the room like a current. Faint. The word meant something specific in this world. It meant diminished, uncertain, without pull. An Omega whose nature barely registered was, in the judgment of most, no useful Omega at all. Not for bonding, not for calming unrest, not for anchoring an Alpha through his harder seasons. Useless, in other words. Decoratively, socially, politically useless. I had heard this my entire life. It should not have still felt like a stone placed on my chest. Aldrich made a small mark on his parchment, I did not see what it said, and moved on. I stepped back to my place by the wall. The crack in the stone was still there. So was I. The evening continued. Wine circulated. Music played from the minstrel's gallery above. The atmosphere shifted from ceremony into something more social. The women moving between clusters of courtiers, conversations blossoming in corners, the careful theater of being seen. No one sought out my corner. I didn't mind, or rather, I had taught myself not to mind, which was not the same thing, but it was close enough to function. I was watching the fire, watching the way the largest log at the center of the hearth had burned hollow, still holding its shape while the inside glowed orange and ate itself quietly. When I realized someone was standing nearby. Not near me exactly, near the same edge of the room. A boy. No, a young man, a servant by his rough-spun clothing, stood at the side entrance with a tray of empty cups, looking pale and rigid, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. I followed his gaze and found two of the Stonecrest women speaking to another servant girl, their voices too low to carry, their expressions too pleasant. The girl's hands were shaking. Something about it made my chest tighten. Without thinking, which was I had learned when I made all of my most consequential decisions, I walked toward the tray-bearing boy, took 2 cups from the low table, and angled myself between the Stonecrest women and the girl with shaking hands. I didn't say anything loud or dramatic. I simply stood there, cups in hand, as though I had business there, until the moment passed and the Stonecrest women drifted toward more interesting territory. The girl let out a breath that was almost inaudible. The boy with the tray looked at me. There was something in his expression I hadn't expected. Recognition. Not of who I was. He didn't know me. But of what I'd done. The small bravery of people who have nothing to lose. I nodded once and returned to my corner. I did not see that anyone else had noticed. I was wrong. At the far end of the dais, a pair of gray eyes had followed the small, quiet, unremarkable movement of a faint-scented Omega in a storm cloud dress, and had not looked away. I did not sleep well in the keep's lower guest quarters. The room assigned to me was small, a servant's room, really, with a straw pallet, a single tallow candle burned down to a stub, and a window no wider than my forearm that looked out onto the inner courtyard. The other Omegas had been given chambers in the eastern wing, where I'd heard the beds had proper wool mattresses, and the windows faced the mountains. I hadn't been told this directly. I had simply followed the servant who pointed me left when everyone else went right, and understood. I lay on my back in the dark, and listened to the keep breathe around me. Stone buildings have their own language. The creak of timber settling, the distant clang of the night guard changing rotation at the gatehouse, wind finding the gaps in the mortar and threading through in a thin whistle that sounded, if you were tired enough and lonely enough, almost like a voice. I had lived 3 years in an edge house on the woodline of Dunhollow, and I knew the language of places that held you without welcoming you. I was used to it. That was the worst part. Not the cold, not the thin mattress, not the fact that my name had been written on Aldrich's parchment with what I was almost certain was a small mark of dismissal. The worst part was how easily I accepted all of it. How my body simply settled into the shape of whatever space was given to me, like water finding the lowest point. At some hour past midnight, I gave up on sleep and sat up. I reached into the small satchel I'd carried from Dunhollow, rough canvas, worn at the strap, and took out the only thing I'd brought beyond a change of linen. A small glass vial, no bigger than my thumb, filled with dried herbs I'd gathered myself from the forest edge. Feverwort, silverleaf, a sprig of dried moonbell that had no curative property I knew of, but smelled like rain and something clean. I had learned herbcraft the way I'd learned most things. Alone, from an old manuscript the village healer had left behind when she died. From trial and observation and the quiet company of the forest, I held the vial and did not think about anything in particular until my heartbeat steadied. Then I set it on the ledge of the narrow window, where the pale moonlight caught the glass and threw small prisms across the stone wall, and I watched them until I felt something loosen in my chest. "You are here," I told myself. "That is enough for tonight." Morning arrived gray and purposeful. The selection's second day, I had been told by the herald's announcement the previous evening, would involve the king's formal assessment, not a distant scan from a throne, but a structured audience in the smaller council chamber, where each Omega would be presented individually. This was, the herald explained in the careful language of official things. An opportunity for His Majesty to observe each candidate's bearing, temperament, and character. What it meant, in the language everyone actually understood, was that the king would look at us one by one and decide which of us was worth his continued attention. I stood in the line outside the council chamber and looked at my hands. They were not soft hands. 3 years of forest work had seen to that. There were calluses at the base of my fingers, a thin scar along my left palm from a thorn bush I'd argued with and lost, a permanent faint stain at my thumbnail from the black walnut shells I'd cracked last autumn for dye. The hands of someone who worked, not the hands of a woman a king would choose. Petra stood 3 places ahead of me in the line, resplendent in fresh amber satin, her dark hair dressed with tiny woven braids and a circlet of hammered bronze. She was speaking quietly with the woman beside her, another Hero Omega named Cressida, taller than Petra and less deliberately beautiful, but with the easy confidence of someone whose worth had never been questioned. They made a handsome pair. The court would see them and understand them immediately. That was its own kind of power. I watched them, not with envy exactly. Envy requires a belief that what the other person has could also belong to you, but with something adjacent to it. Something more like recognition of distance. When my turn came, I walked into the council chamber. It was smaller than the great hall, but no less imposing. A long table of dark oak, 2 tall windows letting in flat winter light, and at the head, in a carved chair that stopped short of being a throne by only a matter of degree, sat King Dominic Vile. He looked different in daylight, not smaller. Nothing about him suggested smallness, but more detailed. The lines of his face were sharper in natural light, the jaw that could have been carved by someone with an argument to make, the slight tension at the corners of his mouth that suggested he spent a great deal of time holding words behind his teeth. He wore no crown today, only a simple dark surcoat, a silver clasp at the collar bearing the wolf crest, and an expression of such complete and practiced neutrality that it would have been unreadable on anyone else. On him, it read like control, like something deliberately held in place. Aldrich stood to his right, parchment ready. 2 other advisors flanked the table, an older woman with iron-gray hair whom I didn't recognize, and a beta warrior in the king's colors whose name I later learned was Rowan, the king's Gamma commander. I stopped at the designated place before the table and dipped into the formal curtsy I had practiced on the forest path 2 days ago, alone, between the trees. "June of Dunhollow," Aldrich said. "My Lord King." My voice came out steadier than I expected. Dominic looked at me. Not through me. That was what I had braced for, the way a man of power looks at a thing he is cataloging rather than seeing. He looked at me. The gray eyes moved once, briefly, across my face, and then settled with an attention that felt almost physical. "You intervened last evening," he said, "between 2 guests and a servant girl." The room was very quiet. I had not expected this. I had expected the standard questions: pack of origin, family line, any notable abilities or training. Not this. Yes, my Lord King." Why? I considered lying, or rather, I considered giving the answer that would sound best. Something about loyalty to the crown's household, or respect for those in service. But something about the directness of his question made a polished answer feel like an insult to it. "Because her hands were shaking," I said, and no one else was close enough to notice. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth exactly, not yet, but a subtle alteration, like a door that hasn't opened but has unlocked. "You are faint-scented," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my Lord King." "Does that trouble you?" The question landed strangely. No one had ever asked me that. They had stated it as fact, as judgment, as conclusion. Not as something that might have an interior. It did once, I said honestly. Now it is simply what I am. The older advisor, the iron-haired woman, made a small sound that might have been approval or might have been nothing at all. Aldrich's stylus moved on his parchment. Dominic held my gaze for one more moment. "Thank you, June of Dunhollow," he said, with a formality that somehow did not feel dismissive. I curtsied again and left. In the corridor, Petra was waiting her turn. She looked at me as I passed, a bright, assessing look, and said, lightly enough that it could be mistaken for pleasantry, "Did he look bored?" "I wouldn't know," I said, and kept walking. The rest of that day unfolded in the particular way of court days, structured on the surface, churning underneath. The Omegas gathered in the upper solar after the individual audiences, a long room with window seats and a fire and the architecture of enforced socialization. I sat near the window with a cup of warm, spiced cider I hadn't asked for, but a servant had pressed into my hands, and I listened more than I spoke. The conversation centered, as it always did in these rooms, on the king. He barely looked at me for more than a moment. Said one of the River Clan Omegas, a woman named Sable, with a quick tongue and honest eyes that I found myself liking. But Cressida said he asked her 3 questions. "He asked me 4, Petra said, from her place at the center of the group, where she sat as naturally as a fire sits at the center of a room. About my Pax trade alliances. He's politically minded, clearly. He's lonely," said the iron-haired advisor's voice, and then I realized it wasn't the advisor. It was a different woman entirely, smaller, sitting in the corner near the door. A beta lady-in-waiting named Mira, who seemed to have forgotten she was in the room with people who might repeat things. She looked up, caught herself, and said nothing further. But the word sat in the air long after she'd swallowed it. Lonely. I looked out the window at the courtyard below, where a group of Kingsguard were running formations in the cold afternoon light. Disciplined, synchronized, utterly purposeful. At the edge of the yard, barely visible from this angle, a single figure stood watching them. Still, separate. Even from this distance, I knew the set of those shoulders. My cider had gone cool in my hands by the time Sable dropped into the window seat beside me and said, quietly enough for only me to hear, "He asked about you, you know. After your audience. I was waiting outside, and I heard Aldrich say your name." I turned to look at her. Her expression was not unkind. It was something more unsettling, curious. Like she was watching something she hadn't expected to find interesting. "What did he say?" I asked. Sable wrapped both hands around her own cup and looked out at the courtyard below, at the still figure at its edge. He said, "Find out more about her." 3 days passed before anything changed. 3 days of the selection's careful rhythm. Morning meals in the Great Hall where seating arrangements said everything about hierarchy and nothing about fairness. Afternoon activities designed to display the Omegas in various lights. Needlework, which I was adequate at. Herbal knowledge, which I was unexpectedly excellent at. And a formal dinner on the second evening where the court's nobility circulated like slow water around stones. And I stood at the edge of things and tried to take up exactly as much space as I needed and no more. Petra flourished in all of it. She had the gift of making every room feel like it had been waiting for her. A natural ease with courtly conversation, a laugh that arrived at precisely the right moment, a way of standing near the king's advisors that suggested intimacy without claiming it. The court noticed her. Aldrich's parchment, I was certain, had her name circled in something favorable. I noticed things too, but differently. I noticed that the servant boy from the first evening, the one with the tray and the pale face, was named Pip, and that he worked double shifts because the keep was understaffed in the lower quarters, and that he ate standing up in the corridor between tasks because there was no time for a proper meal. I started leaving small portions of bread from my own plate at the end of the serving table in the evenings, where they could be taken without acknowledgement by anyone who needed them. I noticed that Sable, for all her quick tongue, went quiet whenever the conversation turned to pack politics. A specific, careful quiet that suggested wounds rather than ignorance. I noticed that Rowan, the King's Gamma commander, watched the training yard from the high window every morning with the focused expression of a man checking for something he hoped not to find. And I noticed Dominic Vielle, not in the way the other Omegas noticed him, cataloging his features, tracking his attentions, measuring the degrees of his interest. I noticed him the way I noticed the hollow log by the hearth on the first night, from the outside, still holding its shape. Functioning. But carrying something inside that burned quietly and consumed itself in private. He was formal at meals. He was brief in the public moments the selection required of him. He moved through his own court the way a man moves through weather he has learned to endure, not suffering exactly, but not at ease either. His advisors orbited him constantly. He was never alone. And yet, there was something solitary about him that had nothing to do with company. I caught myself thinking about what Mira had said. He's lonely. And then I caught myself thinking about a king's loneliness, what shape it would take, what it would look like from the inside. And I stopped, because that was the kind of thinking that had no useful destination for a faint-scented Omega from Dunhollow. On the morning of the 4th day, I went to the Keep's herb store. I had asked permission from the head housekeeper, a stout and efficient woman named Berta, who looked at me the way people look at requests that are too small to refuse and too odd to understand. She'd given me leave to use the lower stillroom for an hour before the morning's formal activities, and I had gone down before the Keep fully woke, when the corridors still held the blue-gray quiet of early morning. The stillroom was exactly what I had hoped. A long, low-ceilinged room off the kitchen passage, with dried bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, and clay pots arranged on shelves with the pleasing logic of someone who actually understood them. It smelled of rosemary and dried chamomile, and the particular dusty sweetness of lavender past its best season. I set my small vial of Dunhollow herbs on the work table and stood for a moment, just breathing. Then I got to work. I had noticed at meals that 2 of the serving staff had the particular pallor and slow movement of people fighting a seasonal lung sickness, the kind that settled in cold keeps during winter and stayed longer than it was welcome. It was common and rarely serious, but uncomfortable, and the keep's own healer seemed occupied with larger concerns. I had the herbs for a simple steam preparation. I made 2 portions, wrote the instructions carefully on a strip of cloth in my small, precise handwriting, and left them in a place Pip would find them. It was a small thing, the kind of thing no one would see. I was tying off the second portion when I heard the door. I assumed it was Berta, coming to reclaim her still room. I didn't look up immediately. The handwriting is yours. The voice was not Berta's. I turned. Dominic Vale stood in the doorway of the still room, not in court dress, but in a plain riding surcoat, dark and unadorned, his hair slightly disordered in the way of a man who had been outside already this morning. He was looking not at me, but at the 2 small cloth packages on the work table, and then at the strip of instructions I hadn't finished tying. I managed, after a moment, to remember how my legs worked. I curtsied. My Lord King, I apologize. I had housekeeper Berta's permission to use the still room. I wasn't aware. I'm not here to correct you. He stepped into the room. It was a small room, and he filled it differently than it had been filled before. Not oppressively, but with a presence that changed the quality of the air. I came down for the same reason. The head healer prepared me a tonic last evening that was not prepared with much care. He said it without complaint, merely as fact. I looked at the shelves, then back at him. What was it meant to address? He paused, as though the question, simple, practical, with no ceremony in it, had arrived at an angle he hadn't expected. Sleeplessness, he said after a moment. I turned back to the shelves before he could see whatever had moved across my face. I scanned the clay pots, found what I was looking for, valerian root, dried properly, and a smaller pot of passion flower that someone had labeled in faded ink, and brought them to the work table. "These won't work as a tonic," I said, keeping my voice even and professional, the way I spoke when I was focused on a task, and trying not to think about the fact that I was making a preparation for the AlphaKing in a still room at dawn. "They work better as a sleep draft, steeped in hot water, not wine. Wine counteracts the valerian." I measured as I spoke, hands moving with the automatic confidence of long practice. "It should be taken an hour before sleep, not immediately before. And not more than 3 nights in sequence, or your body grows accustomed to it, and it loses effect." I realized I had been speaking for some time without deference or pause. I stopped, set down the measure. "Forgive me, my Lord King. I speak plainly when I'm working. I don't mean to." "Don't apologize," he said. Something in his tone made me look up. He was watching me work with those gray eyes, and the expression on his face was the closest thing to unguarded that I had seen from him. Not open, not warm exactly, but present. Genuinely present, in the way that people rarely are with someone they have not decided matters yet. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. "From a manuscript," I said, "and from the forest. Mostly from the forest. Dunhollow is at the edge of the Greywood, yes?" "Yes, my Lord King." I was surprised he knew this. "Near the eastern margin, the old growth section." "The Greywood has a reputation," he said, with something that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Most people from the border villages won't go into it past the first line of trees. Most people haven't needed to," I said, and then immediately thought, that was too much, that was too direct, that revealed something. But he did not look offended. He looked, if anything, more attentive. "What did you need that sent you into it?" The question was quiet and without demand. He was leaning against the work table now, arms crossed, with the posture of a man who was in no hurry, who had, possibly for the first time in several days, nowhere he was required to be. I thought about how to answer, about whether to answer. "Food, at first," I said finally. "After my parents died and the pack's generosity became occasional. And then medicines. And then eventually, I went in because it was the only place no one followed me." I paused. It's very quiet in the Greywood. Even the birds are different. He said nothing for a moment. Then, "I know that kind of quiet." 3 words, spoken simply, without self-pity or theater. But they landed with a weight that I felt somewhere beneath my ribs, in the place where things resonate before the mind has had time to process them. I finished the sleep draft preparation in silence after that, a comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't require filling. I tied the cloth, wrote the steeping instructions on a fresh strip, and placed it on the work table. 1 hour before sleep, I said. Not wine. He looked at the small package, then at me. Thank you, June of Dunhollow. He said my name the same way he had in the council chamber, with a completeness, as though my name were a thing worth pronouncing fully. Not June from Dunhollow as a category, just June. He left before I could think of anything to say. I stood in the still room for a long time after, listening to the keep wake around me, the clatter of the kitchen fires being stoked, the distant sound of the guard change, the first voices of the morning carrying down the stone corridors. Outside, somewhere above me, I heard Petra's bright laugh. The day was beginning. The selection was continuing, and nothing had changed, technically speaking. Except that a king had said my name like it meant something, and I was no longer entirely certain that nothing would. When I entered the great hall for the morning meal, Sable caught my eye from across the room and raised a single brow. She had noticed I'd come from the lower corridor rather than the eastern wing. She said nothing, but the look she gave me was the look of someone filing information carefully away. Petra noticed too. I saw the moment her gaze tracked from my face to the direction I'd come from and back again, quick as a blade's edge. Whatever she calculated, she kept behind her bright smile. And at the far end of the high table, King Dominic Vielle sat in his carved chair and listened to Aldrich read the morning's correspondence, and gave no outward sign of anything at all. But once, only once, when the hall's noise covered the moment enough to make it possible, he looked in my direction. And this time, I did not look at the floor. The selection was supposed to end on the 5th day. It did not end on the 5th day. The announcement came through Aldrich on the morning of the 4th, delivered in the measured tone of a man accustomed to making unexpected things sound administrative. His Majesty had determined that the formal conclusion of the selection would be extended by 3 days to allow for additional consideration. All candidates were to remain as guests of the keep. Accommodation and provision would continue to be provided in full. The solar erupted the moment Aldrich's footsteps receded down the corridor. 3 more days, Petra said, and the way she said it managed to be both complaint and satisfaction. Complaint for the form of it, satisfaction because she understood, as everyone did, that an extension meant the king had not yet found what he was looking for among the clear favorites. And if he had not found it among them, then the field was still open. She looked at me when she said it. I was sitting by the window again. The window seat had become mine by a kind of unspoken agreement, the way particular spots become associated with particular people over enough mornings. Sable was beside me. She made a small sound when Petra looked in my direction. Not quite a laugh, not quite a warning. "Don't," I said quietly, before she could say anything. "I wasn't going to say a word," Sable replied, sipping her cider with great innocence. She absolutely had been going to say a word. The extension changed the texture of the keep. 3 more days meant the careful performances softened at the edges. Not from ease exactly, but from the particular fatigue of sustained display. Even Petra, who had the energy of someone constitutionally opposed to subtlety, became slightly more human by the 2nd evening. I caught her sitting alone in the corridor outside the solar, her bronze circlet set aside, turning it in her hands with an expression I hadn't expected to see on her face. Tiredness, and beneath it, something younger. I almost walked past, but she heard my step and looked up, and the moment passed when I could pretend I hadn't seen. "Does your head ache?" I asked, from the circlet. She looked at me for a moment with the particular wariness of someone who expects an ambush. "Sometimes," she said finally. I reached into the small satchel I'd taken to carrying. It had become a habit, keeping a few preparations with me, and produced a small cloth of dried lavender and feverwort. "Hold it near your temples. Not a cure, but it helps." She took it, looked at it, looked at me. "You're strange," she said. Not unkindly, I thought. More like a fact she was revising as she stated it. "Frequently," I agreed, and continued down the corridor. On the 5th day, the keep received visitors. Not dignitary visitors, not the kind that required ceremony and formal greeting at the gate. These arrived unannounced. 3 riders from the south, bearing sealed correspondence and the particular urgency of men who had ridden hard. I wouldn't have known any of it except that Pip, who moved through the keep's lower passages like water through stone, present everywhere and noticed by no one, told me that evening while I was leaving a bread portion at the serving table. "Southern riders, miss," he said, in the careful voice he used when delivering information he wasn't certain he should have. "From the Caldvale border." 2 of the King's Council were summoned from their beds. The Caldvale border. I knew the name the way people who live near the edges of things know the names of distant threats, abstractly, as a word that appeared in overheard conversations and the pages of the old healer's manuscript, where she'd written notes about treating wounds from border skirmishes. Caldvale was the territory to the south, ruled by a council of old alphas who had contested the Velk boundary for 2 generations. "Is there trouble?" I asked. Pip shrugged with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to have opinions about the troubles of powerful people. "The king was in the war council chamber past midnight, miss." I looked at the bread portion I'd set on the table, then at the vial in my satchel. Then I went back to the still room. I was not trying to see him. I want to be clear about that, not because it changes anything that happened, but because the difference mattered to me. I went to the still room because the still room was where I was useful, where my hands knew what to do, and my mind could order itself around something concrete. I prepared 2 more sets of the lung sickness treatment for the staff, restocked a low pot of dried chamomile I'd noticed was nearly empty, and was reaching for a high shelf when the door opened. Dominic looked like a man who had been awake for a very long time. Not disheveled. He was not the kind of person who came apart outwardly. But there was a particular quality to the stillness around him that was different from his usual controlled composure. Heavier, drawn closer to the bone. He had clearly come from somewhere that had required a great deal of him. He stopped when he saw me. "I didn't think anyone would be here at this hour," he said. "Nor I replied. He almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but the territory around his mouth shifted in a way that I was beginning to learn men it had considered coming. He came into the still room. I turned back to the shelf, giving him the dignity of not being watched, and listened to him settle against the work table with the quiet of someone who has run out of the energy required to perform ease and has arrived, almost accidentally, at the real thing. "The Caldvale Council has made a formal claim against the Northern River Passage," he said. I was not sure if he was speaking to me or to the room. I kept my hands on the shelf. "If they formalize the claim before the spring thaw, they can block the fishing routes through Velk territory. 17 villages depend on those routes." "What will you do?" I asked. A pause. "What I must," he said. Then, quietly, "I'm tired of that answer." I brought down the jar I'd been reaching for and turned. He was looking at the work table, at the small preparations lined up there, with an expression that had nothing to do with herbs. "What would you do?" he asked. "If it were yours to decide." No one had ever asked me that about anything beyond a root tea. I thought carefully before I answered. "I would send someone to the 17 villages first," I said. "Before the council chambers, before the formal response. Someone who could tell me what those routes actually mean to the people who use them, what they carry on them, whether there's another way." I paused. "Powerful men argue about lines on maps. The lines on maps are made of people's lives. Those aren't the same argument." Dominic looked at me steadily. "You have very little patience for the abstractions of governance," he said. "I have very little patience for arguments that forget what they're about," I said, and then heard myself and added, "My Lord King." This time the almost smile arrived fully, brief and real, there and then carefully set aside. "Don't add the title after," he said. "It sounds like you're apologizing for the thought. The thought didn't need an apology." I looked at him. He looked at me. The candle on the work table between us burned without flickering, as though the air in the still room had decided to hold itself still. "There's a plant," I said, after a moment, "called bridgewort. It grows along contested riverbanks. Both sides use it. Different names, same plant." I reached for a pot on the lower shelf and set it on the table between us. Small dried flowers, white with yellow centers, entirely unremarkable. If you sent someone south who knew enough to mention it, the Caldvale River families would recognize it. It might be enough to open a different kind of conversation. Dominic looked at the small pot of dried bridgewort for a long moment. "Do you know anyone who knows enough to mention it?" he asked. The question was careful, deliberately so. I met his eyes. "I might," I said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was the kind of silence that forms when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Not a mistake, but a threshold crossed, and both people on the other side of it knowing, and neither retreating. Rowan appeared in the doorway. He looked at the king. He looked at me. He looked at the pot of bridgewort on the work table, with the expression of a man who has just walked into a room where the furniture has rearranged itself and is choosing not to comment. "My Lord King," he said, "the council is reconvening." Dominic straightened from the work table. All of him returned to its formal arrangement. The composed face, the straight shoulders, the king assembled back into place like armor buckled on. But something remained that the armor didn't cover. A quality in the gray eyes when they came back to me, brief and unguarded before the control reclaimed it. "Good night, June," he said. He left with Rowan. I heard their footsteps on the stone corridor. Rowan's measured, the king's slightly slower than usual. I stood in the still room alone. I looked at the pot of bridgewort. Then I looked at the door. Then I did something I had not done in a very long time. I allowed myself, carefully and without quite admitting it, to hope. What I did not know, could not have seen from the still room, was that in the upper corridor above, Aldrich had paused on his way to the reconvened council, and was looking down through a high narrow window into the lit still room below. His stylus was in his hand. His expression was unreadable. He watched the king leave. He watched me, still standing at the work table. He made a small mark on his parchment. The same parchment, I would later learn, where my name had been written on the first evening with a notation beside it that I had not been able to see. The notation had originally read, "Faint-scented, unremarkable, no further consideration." He drew a slow, deliberate line through it, wrote something else. The last day of the selection arrived like all significant days do, quietly, without announcement, dressed in the same gray morning light as every day before it. I woke before the keep did. I lay on my straw pallet and looked at the small prisms the vial threw across the stone wall and thought about Dunhollow, about the edge house, the wood line, the particular silence of the gray wood in early morning when the mist sat low between the old trees and the world felt unfinished in a way that was not frightening, but sacred. I thought about the 14-mile walk that had brought me here, through mud and cold, with a worn satchel and a dress I'd restitched twice, and no expectations beyond endurance. I had not expected to matter here. I was not yet certain that I did, but something had shifted in the architecture of the keep over these 8 days. Something I could feel in the way space arranged itself around me, the way eyes moved when I entered a room, the way Aldrich had looked at me twice at dinner the previous evening with an expression I could not read, but that no longer felt like dismissal. I rose, I dressed, I went, as I had every morning, to the still room. The formal conclusion of the selection was announced for midday. The great hall was arranged with more ceremony than it had held since the opening night. The tapestries straightened, fresh rushes on the floor. The court's nobility assembled in their proper order along the walls. The Omegas stood together near the dais, in the careful cluster of women who have spent 8 days in proximity and arrived at something more complicated than friendship, but warmer than mere coexistence. Sable stood beside me. She had taken my hand briefly that morning when we'd crossed in the upper corridor, squeezed once, and said nothing. It was enough. Even Petra, standing 2 places to my left, her bronze circlet bright and her amber satin fresh pressed, had looked at me before we entered the hall with an expression that had moved, over 8 days, from calculation to something closer to acknowledgement. She gave me a small nod. I returned it. Whatever happened next, we had been in this room together. That was its own thing. Aldrich stepped forward with his parchment. The hall went quiet in the complete way that only happens when everyone present understands that something irreversible is about to occur. "His Majesty King Dominic Vale," Aldrich began, with the careful formality of a man who has rehearsed this. Having observed the candidates presented through the selection of the Velk territories, has reached his determination. Dominic stood at the center of the dais. He was in full formal dress today. The charcoal surcoat, the wolf crest, the dark presence of a man entirely assembled into his role. His face was composed, unreadable. The gray eyes moved once across the gathered women and settled. I felt it before I understood it. A stillness that moved through me like cold water. Not fear, but the full body recognition of being truly seen. The disorienting sensation of existing completely in someone else's attention. He was looking at me. "June of Dunhollow," Dominic said. The hall did not erupt. It did something more interesting. It inhaled. I heard Petra make a small sound beside me. Not cruelty, I realized. Surprise. Genuine surprise, which was perhaps the most honest thing she had produced in 8 days. I walked forward. My hem was still slightly crooked at the left side. My hands still bore the calluses and the walnut stain, and the thin scar from the thorn bush. My scent was still faint, barely there, a whisper where others were declarations. I was still, in every measurable sense, exactly what I had been when I walked into this keep 8 days ago. I stopped before the dais and looked up at him. He descended 2 steps, not a gesture required by any protocol I knew of, but a choice, deliberate and visible, that brought him closer to my level. The court saw it. I felt the room recalibrate around that single small movement. "June of Dunhollow," he said again, quieter now, for the space between us rather than the hall. "I have spent 8 days watching this court perform worth. I have watched women display their sense, their lineages, their court manners, their alliances." A pause. "I watched you leave bread for a servant boy who had no time to eat. I watched you step between 2 guests and a frightened girl with no audience and no expectation of reward. I watched you speak plainly when plain speech was more honest than Polish. And I watched you offer me Bridgewort, and the reminder that lines on maps are made of people's lives." The hall was so quiet I could hear the candles. "I am not choosing a display," he said. "I am choosing a partner. For this keep, for this territory, for the work that does not end, and the weight that does not lift." Something moved through the gray eyes. Not softness exactly, but the genuine, undefended thing that lives beneath composure when composure is finally set down. "I am asking if you will choose it too." My throat was very tight. "You know what I am," I said. My voice was steady. I had not expected it to be. "You know my scent is faint. You know I come from a village edge house with a worn satchel and a restitched hem. You know that the same pack who sent me here sent me because no one wanted me." "I know," he said. "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I had not prepared for, something that reached past every defense I had built over 3 years in an edge house on the woodline. "Because you have never once in 8 days tried to be anything other than what you are. And what you are," he said, "is exactly what this territory needs." I said yes. I want to be honest about how I said it. Not dramatically, not with grand ceremony. I said it the way I said most things. Plainly, without polish, with my hand still bearing the thornbush scar and my hem still crooked and my eyes full of something I refused to call tears until later, alone, when there was no one to see. "Yes," I said. "I will." What followed was not simple. I want to say that honestly too, because stories that end at the moment of choosing do a disservice to everything that comes after. The court had opinions. Aldrich managed them with his parchment and his hawk-eyed efficiency, and, I later learned, a notation on a certain document that read, "Demonstrates integrity and practical intelligence beyond designation. Full consideration warranted." He had written it the night he'd looked through the high window and watched me stand at the work table after the king had gone. He never mentioned it. I found out from Rowan, who had a Gamma Commander's particular gift for knowing things and releasing them at the precise moment they were most useful. Petra left on the third day after the selection's conclusion. She left well, which surprised me, and then didn't, because I had seen her in the corridor with her circlet in her hands and her face unguarded, and I knew she was more than what she performed. She paused at the gate and looked back once. I lifted my hand. She did too. Sable stayed. Not in the way I stayed. She remained in the keep's service, eventually becoming a liaison between the court and the RiverClan territories, a role that suited her quick tongue and honest eyes so precisely that it seemed as though the position had been waiting for her all along. We took to sharing the window seat in the solar on quiet evenings, two women who had come to a keep expecting nothing and found, each in our own way, a place. Pip became the head of the lower household staff within a year. He was methodical and loyal and remembered every small kindness ever done to him, which made him, I thought, better suited to the role than most. The Caldvale matter resolved in the spring. It resolved because I went south with a small envoy and a satchel of bridgewort and sat with the river families on both sides of the contested passage and listened to them talk about what the water meant to them. Not the political claim, not the boundary line, but the water itself. The fish runs and the flat stones and the crossings their grandparents had used. I brought back 7 things Dominic's council had not known and could not have found on a map. It was not a dramatic resolution. There was no great battle, no sweeping decree. There was a negotiated agreement about shared passage rights and a seasonal fishing protocol that both territories could live with. The 17 villages kept their routes. Dominic read my report at the long oak table in the council chamber with Rowan and Aldrich present. And when he finished, he set it down and looked at me with an expression I had learned by then to read precisely. "You were right," he said, "about the lines on maps." "I usually am," I said, "about the things I say plainly." Rowan made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly converted to a cleared throat. Aldrich made a mark on his parchment. We were married in the keep's inner courtyard on a morning in late spring, when the light came in at a low angle and turned everything gold-gray, and the air smelled of new grass and the chamomile that had been planted along the courtyard wall. Planted there, Berta told me with great practicality, because I had restocked the stillroom supply twice, and she'd decided it was more efficient to grow it closer. It was a small ceremony by royal standards. Dominic had asked me what I wanted, and I had said, something true. So it was small and honest, and attended by people who had earned their place in the room. I wore the storm cloud dress, restitched properly this time, the hem even, the fabric pressed. My hands were still calloused. My scent was still faint. When Dominic took my hands at the ceremony's center, he held them the way you hold something you intend to keep. Not tightly, not as possession, but with the careful, present grip of someone who understands what they're holding and does not take it for granted. He said his vows plainly, without performance. The way I had learned, he said everything that mattered to him. I said mine the same way. I still go to the still room sometimes, in the early mornings before the keep wakes fully, when the corridors hold their blue-gray quiet and the air tastes of beeswax and something clean. I still carry the small glass vial, feverwort, silverleaf, dried moonbell, not as a comfort against hardship, but as a reminder of what I carried into this place before I knew it would become mine. The crack in the great hall floor is still there, too small to repair, too deep to fill. I have stopped thinking of it as a flaw. I think of it now as a feature, as evidence that a thing can be imperfect and still hold. That a foundation can bear weight without being seamless. That sometimes the deepest cracks are simply where the light comes in sideways, illuminating everything around them in a way that smooth stone never could. I was a faint-scented Omega from a village edge house. I came here with a worn satchel and a restitched hem, and 14 miles of mud on my boots and no expectation of being chosen. I was not chosen for my scent. I was not chosen for my lineage or my display or the brightness of my performance in a hall full of people performing worth. I was chosen because I left bread for a boy who had no time to eat, because I stepped between two women and a frightened girl with no one watching, because I said the lines on maps are made of people's lives and meant it, and did not apologize for meaning it. They had mocked the rejected Omega. They had been looking at the wrong thing entirely. This is where the story ends, not with a dramatic final image or an unresolved thread left trailing. It ends here, in a keep that became a home, with a king who became a partner, with a crack in the floor that I no longer try to step over. It ends with June of Dunhollow, standing in a still room in the early morning, her hands already reaching for the herbs, already knowing what needs doing, at peace, exactly as she is, exactly where she belongs.